Coming back to Austin, Texas was depressing, especially considering not only the lack of a black population, but the continued expectation that black people entertain everyone else at the expense of ourselves. For a while, I wrote letters to the editor in the Austin Chronicle. One such letter pointed out the empty buses that I saw during the day, to which Lee Leffingwell thought he would educate me on how the buses were not empty and used by many people. In truth, there were and remain several empty buses because Cap Metro has discreetly maneuvered its service to move mainly students and white collar professionals, leading service workers and night shift employees to be forced to fund our own private transportation just to commute. Writing these letters gave me some satisfaction, but I also noticed that I was not the only person pointing out the issues I raised, and that discriminatory behavior was getting even worse. When I was working on my master's thesis in 2011, I was surprised but validated to calculate that Austin was more segregated than Jasper, Texas, truck dragging Texas for those in younger generations, and I began to eye my city even more critically than I had before. After all, Austin enjoys portraying itself as a liberal paradise where everyone can feel safe, although I started to understand that everyone meant rich, white, and possibly queer people, but no one else. This is often the implicit goal of liberal cities: fabulous reputations with terrible behavior, because the only criteria for being a good person is voting Democrat. Essentially, I voted Democrat, I'm done. Later, I would find out just how cruel the city government would be to people trying to invalidate the standards for being a good person. I had continued to participate in protests until 2015, when I participated in the protest for Michael Brown, complete with police escort. By the end of the protest, I had the same feeling I had during election night for Barack Obama. Nothing is going to change as a result of this. Granted, a black man entering the White House and a black child killed by police brutality are different scenarios, but I realized that at the end of the protests, nothing happened. No action was taken, and everything was likely going to be restored to the status quo. I even took the megaphone and encouraged people to vote, but even that felt hollow since I had almost been a victim of police brutality myself when house sitting for a friend, prompting other friends to inform their neighbors when I watched houses in the future. At the time, I was a very consistent voter. Protesting, writing, going to meetings, voting, all of it felt performative and ineffective, and what felt worse is that people kept pushing for these actions with the knowledge that nothing would change and hoping no one would notice. Being pushed to ineffectual action can also become depressing because all the advice sounds the same, even though the people responsible for the injustice have no self-awareness. 2016 was the year that so many younger people rushed to vote, hoping to deter the likes of Trump entering the White House. Regardless of all the examples and all the threats, people voted to make life harder specifically for black people, basically throwing a temper tantrum after having to look at a black man in the Oval Office for 8 years. Having survived the Bush-Gore debacle of 2000, I was not surprised, but what made several people disgusted was finding out how many people had lied in the polls. After doing so much to get both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton elected, and seeing just how spiteful and controlling so many people were, younger people were in a daze. That disgust would start making us less inclined to vote as elections continued, even as the same people sabotaged us, a fact that directed older populations to harass us as political cycles continued. I pondered over what I would do to combat the anticipated increase in racism, and a colleague and I decided that we would become information activists to inform people about how urban planning worked in language that most people could understand. In a past life, I had wanted to be a social studies teacher, so this would be less of a shift for me. Deciphercity.org would come together by the middle of 2017. Having been in Austin for over 10 years by 2016, I had made a number of friendships, one of whom was another writer who was receiving his doctorate in geography at the University of Texas. He was also a cyclist, which was one of the reasons I was introduced to an organization called Food Not Bombs, where I also met other cycling activists. The graduate student and I kept in touch after meeting at a writing event, and because he knew about my master's in geographic information systems, he invited me to participate in a map making project for the State of Black Austin 2016. During that project, I met my future colleague for deciphercity.org based on her having lived in New Haven, Connecticut, which I knew after attending Yale and living off campus. I was the only black person in the group, but there were also two other people of color because fortunately, the graduate student was from Atlanta, Georgia, making him aware that there were all kinds of people. We created the maps, participated in the conversation, and just as most of the attendees had expected, nothing happened. One of the talking points that neoliberals like to keep repeating is that these things take time, so that after the conversation, the graduate students group reconvened and considered other opportunities for change. During the summer of 2016, I had participated in offering food for the unhoused as part of a collaboration with the church I had attended, which was majority white, and I had been a part of that small group for a little over 2 years. It was once or twice a month. I enjoyed the engagement, and I thought that the team was very united. There was only one rule with the process. The unhoused were made to accept food at the corner instead of the front of the church. It was never clear why there was such a rule, but that rule was supposedly steadfast. At the beginning of our meetups, once I finished helping with the food preparation, I made the announcement, and for weeks, everyone followed the rules, and we went on about our business. None of the brothers and sisters at my church ever demonstrated a problem with the way I spoke because I was careful to be as neutral as possible. However, one day when I made an announcement, one of the white unhoused men started arguing with me, and nobody from my church backed me up, and everyone stood away from me, leaving me to look like the image in their minds, a crazy black woman. The individual called the church office, and a white woman walked outside and began berating me. I asked to meet the pastor because surely this clearly racist individual was not a member of the leadership of the collaborating church, but in stereotypical white woman fashion, she educated the stupid subhuman black woman that she was leadership. People often believe that non-white cultures are automatically sexist. I was surprised that someone so bigoted was an associate pastor, but no one supported me in that moment, so I said nothing. There was another black man who was part of my church, but he said nothing in that moment and berated me to be humble when I saw him again. I had never felt so abandoned in public. Still believing in public input meetings, I put together maps and went to a Cap Metro meeting in January 2017. Before the actual meeting, there was the audience networking session where people tended to conduct whatever business they meant to deal with at the meeting before listening to prepared speeches. There were a cluster of older white people who were talking about transportation in Northwest Austin, and they were surprised and frustrated by the lack of buses. Having studied African American history, calculated segregation in Austin, and lived in Northwest Austin, I began the delicate dance of talking about race without saying the word race. Well, there was a concern about the types of people who would be taking buses in Northwest Austin, which is why there were very few routes dedicated to that area, I said. An older white woman played dumb, smiled, and said, "Oh, you mean like my mother?" "No," I responded, and the conversation would have stalled, except an older white man said, "Yes, I remember those concerns, and we're paying for it now." Yes, and now that the communities have been developed in such weird ways, it will be harder for there to be any buses, When I lived in Northwest Austin off Jollyville Road, I always knew that I would have to be home by a certain time because no buses would be at that part of town during the night routes. It was very difficult to work late, I replied. There are also a lot of people who work different shifts who are forced to buy cars to get out to some areas because communities didn't want them. And now that's because there isn't any public transportation, said a rude racist voice. And I looked over to see who I now know was a council member, smirking at me before ignoring any response I might have made, speaking longer than the allotted time, and then flouncing off to be important somewhere else. This council member had no idea who I was, what my backstory was, no self-awareness that I was discussing the segregation that the residents from that district had wanted, or anything else. All that mattered was shutting up a stupid subhuman black woman so that a white council member could be important.